about him. Hi, Matti. Yes, so Matti works as a researcher at the TU Wind Energy. He's one of our colleagues, and he focuses on modeling wind and solar generation variability and forecast uncertainty, and how they impact power and energy system. He's a Doctor of Science and Master of Science degrees from Aalto University School in Finland. Yes. So please, Matti.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anka. And also thanks a lot for Bent. I think he left already, but that was an excellent presentation and gives a very nice starting point also for mine, and I'm sure the others' presentations as well. So let me just check that you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen. Can you make a test? Yes, also the changing.
Okay.
And please, before this, Damian, you are still hanging with your hand. Do you want to say something before Matti starting? Maybe it's just the old, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll take my hand down. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. So please, Matti.
Hey, thank you very much. So I'll present a bit about our developments in simulating VRE. So I'll first tell what is VRE in the first slides. Focus on time series and how we apply them in power and energy system studies. And I think here it's important to note how this connects to Ben's presentation, because he talked a lot about the operation of the power system. And here I will talk about how to simulate time series for modeling the future scenarios when we have more wind, more solar in the system with different technologies perhaps. So this kind of links that it's taking, let's say, how it is to operate the current system, but then sort of model in the future how the system can be different with different amounts of wind and solar, including also the system balancing due to forecast errors. But just to say here that it doesn't mean that it's not about forecasting tomorrow's balancing, but it's modeling how the balancing kind of could operate in 2025, 2030, or even towards 2050. So that's kind of how it relates to Ben's presentation. So in the beginning, maybe you all know it, but I'll just walk through quickly on what is VRE generation and what are some of the key sort of key things to remember about VRE generation when we go to modeling it, and why does it matter? Ben also already explained very well what are the challenges, but I'll just pinpoint a few, maybe European perspective on that. Then I'm going to go through some of the developments we have done on simulating VRE time series. I will look at it from sort of my and our group's point of view, but I think they are relatively how the field is progressing in general. So I'll talk a little bit about reanalysis data, so how we can make this kind of long European scale analysis of tens of years for different power and energy system modeling needs. Then I'll also talk about the new developments, is how we can achieve higher spatial and temporal resolution. The kind of standard weather data is often hourly. So how we can go to 15 minutes and 5 minutes, as was also discussed in Ben's sort of presentation, that we need to go to those higher resolutions. And then I'll talk a little bit also about the forecast errors. And again, this is not about forecasting tomorrow, but it's looking at sort of in a probabilistic manner about the forecast errors, how they could be in 2025, 2030, and how could we be prepared for those when we plan, let's say, the market structures and how much research we need and so forth. And then I'm going to go through some of the applications of these developments and recent projects, both academic and what we do with our industry partners. So what is VRE? So VRE means variable renewable energy. It's renewable, but it's also variable, and I guess you all know that. But just a visualization on the right-hand side, how the variability in the meteorological domain transfers to variability in the power domain. Here is shown with a simple turbine, turbine level power curve without looking at the storm shutdown. We also look at the storm shutdown. I'll go to that. But just the idea. So when we use meteorological data, we want to model the wind speeds, not in one location, but in all of the locations and in a time, and also in radians. It's in principle a similar sort of transformation. And then, as Bent was also saying, then we say, okay, this is how it translates to the power domain, and I'll talk also about that. And we focus on the wind and solar PV. There is also concentrated solar power, which we have done a little bit, which is maybe relevant only for maybe most southern Europe, perhaps North Africa. And also runoff river hydropower, with some of the similar weather data can be used, but we haven't focused on that. But the similar meteorological data can be also utilized to analyze that. And then here is a sort of on the right-hand side, a picture about what when I talk about forecast errors later on, what kind of words I use. So we have the in the black, the small black line is available power. So this is the online every time unit. This is the available power of wind in this example, or solar. You have for one plant, region, or country. It doesn't really matter conceptually. And this is what we can simulate. So we can measure it for the past, but we can simulate it, let's say, for 2025 or 2030. In this available power, we don't yet consider the curtailment. We can overlay the curtailment when we go to power and energy system studies, but the standard output from this kind of VRE time series is usually the available power. So this is how much you could generate if there is no curtailment command or any sudden failure. Then we have, for example, the day-ahead forecast simulated. So this is what it could look in 2030 with certain setup. And then we have hour-ahead forecast. And we can be flexible, so we can have 5 hours ahead, we can have 30 minutes ahead. But the idea here is handled in a stochastic manner in the simulation, so that as can be expected, that the variability gets smaller, or let's say the difference between the available power and the forecast gets smaller. So that's considered in the simulation. So you can see here roughly that the red line, which is the hour ahead, is closer to the available power than the day ahead. So we can simulate and sort of study the uncertainties, also considering the forecast horizon. And that we have also for solar PV. But I'll go to the details. It's just, so what does available power mean? What does day ahead and hour ahead? And again, this is simulated for a future system. And then a little bit about why do we care about the time series aspects. Again, it was very well already in Ben's presentation. Many of you, I think, have seen these wind atlases. Here we have the global wind atlas from DT Wind Energy on the right-hand side, where you can see where it's windy and where it's not windy. You can get the distribution of winds. But this information doesn't really give that sort of temporal information that if it's windy in Denmark and UK, how likely is it that there's wind production simultaneously, both in UK and Denmark, which of course, as Bent mentioned, impacts the value of trading and between these countries or in balancing. And it doesn't really tell about what kind of ramps can we expect. So Bent again mentioned about the storm shutdown possibilities. So you cannot really see that, and especially you could see from here how is likelihood of high winds, but you cannot really see the kind of temporal aspects of how the storm shutdown happens and how the restart happens in a temporal domain, considering also multiple regions and countries. But we need this information about the time series because that's how the electricity market operates, and also the power system needs to be balanced at all times. So basically we need for those studies time series. And then I would just share a few examples. Sorry that this picture is not the highest resolution, but just some recent examples that even though I talk here about modeling the future scenarios, but we can already today see many sort of impacts of having a lot of VRE generation in the system. So here is one example was later in last year. I think it was the first time in the Nord Pool, which considers the Nordics and Baltics, but also operates in the continental European countries, some of them, that we have very widespread negative prices. So on this hour, when there was a lot of wind power in the system, we see a negative price basically on all regions simultaneously. So even though it's not likely that we have exactly the same wind power in all the regions simultaneously, they are still correlated, so we can expect to have high wind at least in neighboring regions. They are all very interconnected, so there's an overflow of energy in the system, and then the prices can get negative Of course, these negative prices can be impacted about the exact way of sort of subsidies, but at least it can get to zero. So this is sort of one impact we already see now, a very large spread negative prices. And then there is, of course, the opposite. So sometimes very high. This was from the UK. So very high power prices when the wind is low at some other time steps. So again, it's the time, right? This is a high wind generation time step, and this is a low wind generation time step. And one needs to understand the spatiotemporal spread of those events to understand the likelihood of such events. And of course, this can impact TSOs, it can impact system balancing, but it can also a lot impact the producers, because exactly at these times you produce a lot of wind and you can get a negative price. So your revenue might be negative if you cannot curtail all of the production. So it impacts the system, but it also impacts the generators. And then, so here, this is mostly on the sort of spot market, where the bulk of the energy is being served. But we also see a lot of impacts already on the balancing market. This is from Belgium, where, as Paul mentioned, we made a study looking also at the balancing. So at the end of last year, there was this very high peak balancing prices due to basically wind forecast errors. So there, as you can see, even bigger prices, even though the volume might be less. So we see both the variability of wind and solar impacting the system, and then also this added, because this is impacted by the forecast errors. So it's like a sudden uncertainty on the VRE generation. And then maybe but you could still say, okay, well, fine, these things have happened, so why don't we just use the historical data? We have measured wind and solar data. We have all the measured data from a few years with a lot of VRE in the system. Let's just use that in our studies. Why do we need to simulate anything? Because simulation is always not the real life. The challenge is that we only have a few years, maybe 5 years of measurements where we really have a lot of wind and solar in the system. And even in some countries, Europe, we don't yet have that much wind and solar. So it's a limited time range where we have sort of measurements that are really meaningful. And the measurements, if you look at the power domain, they cover the existing VRE fleet. So we might have changing technologies in the future, maybe tracking PV, different type of wind turbines, which we are also testing in these models. And it will have a different geographical distribution. So maybe in Poland, for example, maybe there is not so much wind yet, but in the future, when it expands, we can expect a different geographical spread. So the Poland's sort of aggregated wind generation output will look quite different, because of course there's the geographical smoothing effect that it's not windy at the same time in all places around Poland. So these are the main reasons for simulations. We can have tens of years of data, so we can look at those extreme storm cases or extreme low wind cases. We can model the changing VRE technology, so we can overlay different technologies, different amounts of wind and solar, and then changing geographical spread, so we can model different scenarios of the future. So that's sort of why we want to simulate, not just use the measured data. So then some developments on about simulating this weather-dependent generation or VRE generation. I will take it from the point of view of our developments, which happens in the sort of framework of the CORRES tool. It's correlations in renewable energy sources. But as I said, this is roughly, I think, follows the general tendencies in the sort of field. And that's about generating time series. It's meant to generate on a large scale, so they're meant for large scale power and system studies, but still going to high temporal and spatial resolution. I'll get back to that. But the idea is not to generate just one region, one country, but let's say all of Europe and basically all of world. In a way, the current capabilities are global, so we can apply this anywhere in the world. And it models the VRE variability. So this is about the available power. Sometimes it's a lot of wind, sometimes it's not so much wind, and all the spatiotemporal dependencies. But then also the VRE forecast uncertainty. Don't worry about that in the brackets. That was left from some previous presentation from where I copied the slide. But we also have the VRE forecast uncertainty, so we can also look at the sort of uncertainty. As I said, these are two somewhat different aspects that variability is just what you have in wind. Sometimes it's just windy and sometimes it's not windy, and that's just sort of how it is. But the VRE forecast uncertainty is an additional step on top of that you cannot really forecast it, and that changes day ahead, hour ahead, and online. But these are somewhat two different aspects which we both need to consider, and they are both considered in the Chorus model. And sort of this is again sort of conceptually similar what Bent was saying. Again, the difference here is that this is applied on a future scenario, so towards 2050, 2030, 40, 50. But we have the meteorological data, so from there we know when it's windy, when it's not windy, when there's a lot of irradiance, when there is not irradiance, and we use different weather data sets. ERA 5 is the newest Reanalysis dataset, global, so it gives you globally, historically, so the past, let's say 35, 40 years, when it was windy and when it was not windy, and same for the irradiance. So this is the historical dataset. Then we also have the global wind atlas. I'll get back to that. That gives us higher spatial resolution. But that's the meteorological data, so we can sort of understand in a time series context when it's windy, when it's not windy. And again, so it's a long-term time series, so 30 or 40 years, so we can find those extreme events and their likelihoods. Then we have the conversion to power generation. As I said, we want to model different technologies. It could be tracking for solar, could be different for wind. And that's when we translate from the meteorological domain into the power domain, so we can apply it in power and energy system studies. And here we are focused now quite a bit on modeling wind wakes. So this is when the one turbine is shadowing the other one and you have a reduced power output from the entire plant. I'll discuss a bit about this, where we have focused a lot also about modeling the large scale wake, so from one plant to another, which is quite relevant when we talk about something of 2 gigawatts, 5, 10 gigawatts of offshore energy islands with a lot of co-located turbines which will shadow each other. So we can model those impacts. Then we can model the storm shutdown. I have some examples on that. This was Bent also coming to that. When we have very concentrated wind installations, we want to sort of understand what does it mean if you have 10 gigawatt of co-located wind power plants. What's the likelihood that there's going to be a storm shutdown? Basically, what is the extreme case when you go from 10 gigawatt to 0? Maybe in an extreme case due to an extreme storm event. So those we have, and then we have some bonus for the PV lib, and then we need to know about the turbines, current turbines, future turbines, their power curves, hump heights, and also how they are spread around the area we want to study. As Bent was mentioning, that we have this squares in Denmark, but we want to expand it here for Europe and beyond, and we want to know what are the current power plants, but also about the future power plants, what could be their spread in the different regions in the world. And when we put that together, then we have the VRE time series that we can plug in. And this is you can model a singular plant in Chorus, you can model a regional or a country-wise, so we can do all of that sort of spatial, and that's just the post-processing. So we always simulate per power plant. Not individual turbines, but individual power plants are always modeled, but then we just post-process the data to basically what the study needs. So should we have a very detailed study of power plant level, maybe for offshore plants, or more regional view, but that depends actually on where it's applied, these time series. So a little bit about this. If you have studied this type of approaches, you might know about the different reanalysis datasets. This reanalysis methodological dataset, that it's a view of the historical weather data. I can later talk a little bit about how could climate change impact, how these things look in the future. But let's say the standard approach is to take the weather data from the last 30 or 40 years, so it could be from 1980, let's say to 2020, to take that 40 years of weather data, apply the different technologies and amount of wind and solar on top of that, so we can study different scenarios, this amount of wind, this amount of solar, and then we say, okay, this is how we represent going forward with these different technologies. But these reanalysis datasets are global. They are freely available, for example, the ERA 5. However, it's very coarse. So this gives you a data point, considering that 40 years on our resolution, but only every 30 kilometers. So it doesn't really consider in detail the change from offshore to onshore, the coastal for wind, some mountains and forests. So we have overlaid on top of this the very high resolution global wind atlas, and here are some links. I will send the slides later on if you want to look in more detail, where we have actually higher than a kilometer resolution, and we overlay that on top of the Reanalysis, because the Reanalysis data is time series, but the global wind atlas data is a distribution, so it's not yet time series, but we merge those two, so we can get in the time series domain very also high spatial resolution. And you can see here the coloring, that if the coloring is blue, that means that the global wind atlas upscales the Reanalysis wind speed. So it means that the Reanalysis wind speeds are too low, and the global wind atlas high resolution data says that they should be higher to consider the global sort of terrain and such impacts. And when it's red, it says actually that the Reanalysis is too high, so that it will slightly downscale. And here it just means upscale and downscale just means a better representation of the reality. So you can see that some mountainous regions, the Reanalysis is too low, it's quite blue in Spain or around the Alps, for example. And then again, in some coastal, it's a little bit too high, the Reanalysis, maybe Denmark and some parts of the UK. So this is how we go from the rough ERA 5 resolution of 30 kilometers to something like 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And from the paper, you can read more about this if you are interested. Then on top of that, so now we have a detailed model of the weather data. We can say, okay, when was it windy and when not windy in the different places around Europe, and it's in time series domain on outer resolution at this point. Then we need the methodological to power transformation, and then we have applied a lot of new developments of modeling wakes. So you can see a visualization on the right-hand side. What is the difference from going to a turbine level power curve, which is the sort of a continuous line, to this dashed line, which is the plant level power curve. We can model different layouts and different number of turbines, type of turbines, and so on. And this gives us a better representation of how to go from meteorological data to power. And this can be quite crucial if we model something like the energy islands when we have 10 gigawatt and you have a lot of turbines shadowing each other. So to understand the power output, one is to do these wake studies, including far-to-far wakes, which we have also capabilities to do. Yeah, and then we have a storm shutdown model. I'll get back to that a bit later on. But this is how we model from the meteorological data to the power domain transformation. For solar, we use a high resolution ERA 5 data, ERA 5 land. This is only for the land variables. That gives us a 9 kilometer resolution. And then we use a PV lib, so we use an external sort of package to do the conversion, where we need to choose the panel type and the inverter model and so forth. Then I'll just, so this is a quick overview. You can read in more detail in the slides and click in the different papers if you're interested. But then just, how does it work? That's important, right? We are now simulating. We're not using the measurements, we are simulating. But we need to understand, is it working? Because otherwise we cannot really have any trust in this approach. So how we do it is we simulate that 30 or 40 years, but then we look at those years, let's say recent 2 to 3 years, when we know that we had a lot of wind and solar in the system. We model that in detail and we see, can it replicate that? And then we say, if it can, we say, okay, now we have kind of the trust that we can model those 40 years and also with different technologies in the future. When we do that, we don't have any more to measure data, because then we are really looking to the future. But we always start by validating how it looks in modeling the past. So I'll just go relatively quickly. We have a paper about this in review, hopefully out soon. So here are some examples when we model the Danish wind production. This is onshore. On the right-hand side, you can see the time series and the histograms. So the histograms on the middle and the left-hand side tell what's the likelihood of having a low or a high wind generation events. Here is important to note that this simulation from the CORRES does not include any curtailment. So if there is any curtailment command, that will come on top of the red line. And we see a fine match. You can see that there's a little bit of a mismatch in the highest production, but that's also when we expect the curtailment to occur. So we expect that the CORRES does a little bit too high maximum generation. It's possible to post-process it on the CORRES results, but we haven't done it here because it needs a detailed grid model. And you can see that on the sort of scatter plot on the left bottom, there are some time steps when the measured was significantly lower than the simulated, but this we also expect sometimes to happen due to some unexpected events sort of in the real world. But we see a fine representation. I won't go through this, but I put you a different for different countries some examples that we see a fine representation overall. You can see that when we look at Denmark and when we look at Sweden, you can see that when I sort of go in between the slides, the distribution changes, and this is because the model can now represent the geographical distribution because Sweden is a much bigger country. It's a bigger spread of the turbines, so we move the probability mass closer to the center. So that's about the geographical smoothing. So it's, if you look at Sweden as a whole, it's more let's say average. The wind generation, but the model can represent that. In France, there's a little bit some mismatch, but this is also because in the measurement data there is a mismatch in the capacity factor. So we see a little bit over estimate of the capacity factor for France, but if you look at the different sources for ENTSO-E or Reanalysis or something else, they also give a quite wide range. So this is also to note that sometimes the historical data is not that you have one data, but from different providers, you might see a different historical data. So it's also a bit difficult sometimes to say what should we aim at exactly. But we discussed this actually with some French, from the French TSO, and they seem it looks fine. Germany, Poland, Norway, Netherlands. This is the one where I have offshore wind. So you can see it looks very different. There is one onshore and it was offshore. So we see much higher likelihood of this very high wind generation events. This is for the Dutch fleet. So the likelihood of all generators producing at the same time is higher. And there we see a little bit more scatter because the offshore wind is so they are very close to each other, these large power plants. So we expect a little bit more uncertainty. And I have always in the part of the pictures on the right bottom has been this one generation ramp event. So we also, in addition to looking at can we represent the sort of distribution of the generation, we always looked at can we represent the ramping of the power time series, and that has also been fine. We consider with these comparisons. So. Yeah, we have a paper coming out on this. We have it in the older papers, but we see that we find that we can validate and we can use the ERA5 combined with the Global Wind Atlas and the ERA5 Land for Solar to represent wind in the current fleet. So that gives us the sort of trust that we can also go towards modeling the future scenarios with, let's say, 40 years of weather data for any number of studies, like dispatch studies, optimized investments. Or studying, let's say, some extreme cases. What's the likelihood of an extreme storm case when you have 40 years of data? You can say, okay, this is the extreme when we have North Sea full of offshore wind. What's the likelihood that there is an extreme storm that sort of cuts down the wind generation in everywhere because it's 30 meters per second everywhere at the same time. Then a little bit of, but still up to here, this is hourly data. And this is still mostly used in the day-ahead market, but in many applications we need high resolution data, as Bent was also saying. So how can we get that, and how can we get the forecast errors? Because up to here is just the available power. So here I will just give a very brief sort of view because it will take a lot of time to go through this in detail. But we have a stochastic simulation model, part of the CORRES. So the weather data is hourly from ERA5, so we cannot directly go to 5 minutes using that. But we have a stochastic model which, let's say, creates in a sort of artificial way, creates representative variability intra-hour. So on the right-hand side in the magenta, here it's called WRF, but it's the meteorological data. On the right-hand side, you can see that the magenta line, the thicker line in the bottom, it's kind of smooth because it's an hourly resolution. And then the blue and the red line are with some different stochastic parameters, but you can see that they fluctuate even intra-hour. So controlling these, by controlling these parameters, we can sort of virtually create intra-hour variability. And then when we control them just right, based on measured data, of course, and theory, we can make a representative, even though we don't have weather data up to 5 minutes, we can make a representative time series, considering all the spatio-temporal dependencies that reflects also the sub-hourly resolution. And that's quite a lot of details in how this is exactly done, but that's the idea, that we artificially create the sub-hourly resolution. And we did this, for example, in the study for the Belgian ENTSO-E last year. So you can see sort of the progression in the left-hand side here. You can see measured 10 minute. We had some measured 10-minute wind speed, and this is the 10-minute ramps. So this is the change that you can see in 10 minutes. In the green, sort of in the middle, you can see the direct output from the meteorological data. This is just linearly interpolated from the hourly to 10 minutes. So it's way too little variability. Then in CORES, we add virtual or the sort of stochastic variability on top of, so the blue happens on top of the green, so we add it on top, but it is still Gaussian. So you can see that now let's say the level of variability is approximately correct, but we missed the peaks. So in the newest development, we also created the T-distributed stochastic engine on the right-hand side in the red, and this is sort of the newest. I will not go into this, how this T-distributed thing is added on top of it, but you can read it from the paper. But so now we can get a representation. So we still rely on the meteorological data for the hourly resolution, but in a stochastic way, we can add the sort of the sub-hourly variability on top of it. So that's the sort of development on how to achieve the sub-hourly resolution representative for large-scale studies. And then again, here it's due to time, I will not go into detail, but we have also sort of a similar stochastic engine for making the day-ahead and the hour-ahead forecast errors. So here is important to state again that the idea of this model is not to model tomorrow. That's not, it's a very different thing from what Ben was saying, that we have different forecasts. That's for operation for tomorrow. This here is meant to represent the forecast errors, also considering the spatio-temporal dependencies. So we could apply this model and use it in 2025, 2030. And it's not, yeah, so that's a very different use case for forecasting tomorrow. This is to make a representative, so the representativeness depends on the forecast horizon. It depends on the spatial distribution. So if you have more distributed wind or more distributed solar PV, then this will show less uncertainty on an aggregate level. So it matches what Ben was saying, that it's more difficult to forecast a very concentrated solar PV versus very distributed solar PV. But the idea here is not to try to optimize that forecast for tomorrow, but is to take that information and use it for a future system and say, this is the level of forecast error you're expected to see in 2025 or 2030. So you can run, for example, intraday or balancing market studies in the future with representative time series. So yeah, so that's sort of a key difference in what we are aiming to do here. But here you see some examples. So we see the available power, day ahead and hour ahead, and you can put intraday. It's very flexible. You can do any forecast horizons ahead. It will all consider all the spatio-temporal dependencies related to that. So again, due to time, I had to go some things quite fast, but then maybe you are thinking, well, how can we use any of this? It's just some time series here and there and some things simulated, but where is it used? So we use it in energy system investment studies. So there, when we combine, so from CORES, we get the European level wind and solar time series, onshore wind, offshore wind, with the resolution that is wanted for future scenarios. So we can model different technologies. We can model offshore wind. In the picture, you can see offshore wind deep in the North Sea, where we don't have yet that wind, but with this model, we can simulate how would it look if we would have it there, considering all that it's far away from onshore, that it's high capacity factor, but also that it's correlated in a certain way with all the neighboring, all the sort of onshore countries and so forth. So that's what we can do. And then they are used in here in the Balmoral. We do this with DT management, but in a energy system optimization algorithm, there we can see optimal scenarios. So a little bit like Ben was saying, we also in this one look at the socio-economically optimum So what kind of development of the future scenario should we build? Onshore wind or offshore wind on solar PV? We can combine different technologies. Should we build tracking? And having those sort of CapEx and OpEx numbers for those technologies, then we can compare different options for the future with different technologies. So some of the things we have done, I will just mention it here, just an application example. We compared here the sort of meshed offshore grid in the North Sea versus the radial. So in this one, we have the old school radial connections between the countries. Of course, there is offshore wind, but it's not part of the transmission sort of infrastructure. And we tested against a scenario when we have also combined the hubs. So then the blue dots there are the offshore energy hubs, and then the blue lines are sort of interconnectors related to those. So yeah, from the papers you can read more, but just the role of CORES is to produce the time series, for example, for those offshore plants in the middle of the North Sea where we don't have really any measured data, and we can simulate that for 40 years. So we can look also about the extreme storm events and so forth, or choose a specific year we want to look using the investment studies and so forth. Then we also look similarly at the sector coupling impacts. I will run through this, but just to mention that we can look also the power to heat and power to X things. But this is more with the energy system optimization, so it's just an example of where we can use the CORES as an input. And also how that relates to the development of the offshore energy hubs. But I will run through this due to time. Then we have also the balancing tool chain, where we can also apply all of the forecast. So we can do a day ahead market model optimization at the up to spot. Then we can go to the balancing model optimization. There will be different inputs coming from CORES. So we have the day ahead to optimize the day ahead market model, let's say in 2030. So again, it's not meant to optimize tomorrow, but it's to sort of simulate this operation in, let's say, 10 years time. Then we can have the hour ahead forecast for the balancing model. So how we translate from the day ahead to the sort of hour ahead, and then all the way we can do online up to the area and frequency control. So it's kind of as Ben and their guys are doing right now in the system, but this is looking at how could that thing with all the markets all the way to the online look in 10 years time when we have maybe that 10 gigawatt energy island in the North Sea. So that's where this is, how this is meant to be used. Yeah, and then some other so up to here those system optimization, that was more like our academic project. Then we also work with ENTSO-E for modeling wind and solar for future from CORES. So here you can see a visualization what countries are considered. Some of the countries seem gray here, but that's just because they don't have much existing wind. I put a figure here, we look at the existing wind, but also we can model the future. So also then the gray countries can have some color, so we can simulate them for the future. And this is something we have done, and we actually hope to keep this data freely available, but that's a discussion we have currently with ENTSO-E. So if you have interest, so the idea is that for all the regions, you will have different time series of existing, different wind and solar time series towards the future with different technologies, so it can be used in optimization. We did this together with the ENTSO-E scenario modeling group. So we try to find that representative time series for those, like the 10-year network development plan. That's what they do, but we provide the inputs for them. But if you are interested in this, you can contact me and I can try to see when we could possibly have it available. But I hope we can. 35 plus years. I think we have like 38 years for this one. Then we looked, so that's still on outer resolution, but then we looked also here in some of the details, the Belgium offshore plants. You can see here Belgium and the Dutch plants, how they are aligned. And we looked at this 2026. So they already have these power plants toward 2020, but we look at how about the future power plants looking at 2026. How do those go together and what is the impact on the onshore Belgium systems? We looked at ramp rates, storm shutdowns, forecast errors. And here we used the stochastic simulation, so we went to 5-minute resolution, still using those around 38 years of data. So here's just an example a snapshot of one of the extreme storm cases. We identified what the Belgium case. So we don't need to go in details what are exactly the different plots here, but the important to say is the difference between the red, blue, and the magenta line. So here the red, blue, and the magenta line, they are exactly the same new offshore power plants, exactly the same power curve and location, except they have a different storm shutdown procedure. So the red one has the standard 25 meters per second on turbine level. So of course the plant doesn't go down exactly at the same time, 25 meters per second, but the individual turbine goes when the 10-minute average is about 25 meters per second. But then with the blue and the magenta, we look at different sort of smooth or storm shutdown operations. And you can see that in this extreme case, because Belgium offshore is a very, very small region, that's what also Ben was saying, that it depends on the geographical spread. What is it a big problem, these storm shutdowns or not? But this is an example that could happen also when we go to that 10 gigawatt offshore energy island that is so co-located that when the storm hits, it could impact basically all the power plants at the same time. But the important thing is by having a control shutdown operation, we have kind of a more smooth shutdown. So we can still go to zero, but with much longer time and have lower ramp rates, which is also easier to forecast, which we also show in the report. Here is also a strange thing that we didn't model here a smooth return from the storm, but based on this input, then the Elia is also saying that, okay, yeah, we need to also consider a smooth return, because here is like a huge ramp when everybody returned from the storm. But this is, I think, what they are now also considering, that we need to control with some commands also, that we have a smooth return from the storm. But from the Chorus point of view, this is why we need 5-minute stochastic thing, because this is 5-minute resolution. We need to go to finer than our resolution. And also we need to consider all the wakes and things like this in detail to model sort of this detailed exactly each plant, considering every turbine, how they impact the wakes, how the different farms also impact each other. So the new farms, when the wind direction is from a certain direction, from the southwest, they can shadow the existing farms, and that can also impact the ramp rates. So all of that is considered in this work. We are also in the North Sea wind power hub together with Energinet, Gasuni, and TenneT. Our role, or in a report for that consortium or work, our role is to simulate, so we don't do the energy system modeling, that's done by EEA, a consultancy, but we provide the inputs also on the wind and the solar time series, so how they operate with this long time series, going deep into the North Sea. Yeah, and then there is also some others, but I will leave it to here. I will send the slides later on, so if you're interested, you can have a detailed look. I'll just mention that up to now, I said that we just use the historical weather data. So we have the 1980 to 2020, let's say 40 years. We just translate that to the future, but we can have climate change. So we are also working to understand what is the role of climate change in changing this. So we wouldn't just copy the historical weather data to the future, but we would actually look, maybe the climate change is changing winds and solar irradiance in some parts of Europe or world. So this is also something we are, and it's quite topical